This story was submitted by a listener yesterday, April 22nd, 2025. Thank you for sharing your story with us. He says, "This story began likely before you were born. I had a best friend, and we grew up like brothers. We went fishing, hiked, shot pool, worked on cars, back in the day when you actually could. When he was 16, he dropped out of school and ran off with a 20-year-old woman. He told me they drove down to Mexico to get married since he was underage. They got there and discovered they didn't have enough money to pay for a wedding, so they decided to return and simply tell everyone they were married. They rented a garage apartment, and then he needed a job. At the time, Vietnam was raging, and even though he had a hearing issue, most employers wouldn't hire you if you were able to be drafted. They simply didn't want to spend the money training you only to have you drafted. The only job he could find was working nights at a gas station. Back then, they were all full service, and many were open all night, so he took it. He wasn't making much, and sometimes they simply didn't have enough money for bills. He told me one week they were so broke, all he could afford was a bag of potatoes, so they ate potatoes all week. A few years rolled by, and he had found a good job as a machinist. He bought a small, older home, and they had their first baby. I had gotten married and had two of my own. We always kept in touch. Then suddenly he seemed to have dropped off the grid. I called and got no answer. I drove by his home and no one was there. Weeks went by. Then one night I got a call from him. I said, "Man, where have you been?" He replied that he had been in a rest home. What? He said he didn't want to talk about it over the phone, but that he'd come over and explain. He arrived and we sat in the dining room, and he began this tale. It jumped back to the time when he still lived in the garage apartment and was just starting out. He told me about what had happened. He began with his brother. Now I knew his brother, and he was one of those truly sleazy individuals. He seldom worked, but always managed to find an older woman who he could move in with, use her car, and even use some of her money, at least until they got wise and tossed him out. Just painting a picture. One day he came over to my buddy and took him aside and told him his wife was cheating on him. My buddy refused to believe him, but he continued. He said, "When you run out of cigarettes, haven't you wondered why she still has some? And when you're flat broke, she still has change in her pockets." He said, "I'm telling you, as soon as you leave for work, a guy is coming to your home." My buddy said he still couldn't believe it. That night he got ready for work as usual and then drove off, but he parked on the next street with a view of his apartment. 15 minutes later, a car pulled up and a guy got out and went in. He was a lot more patient than I would have been. At any rate, he waited until the guy left and then followed him home. After that, he went to a friend's house and asked to borrow his gun. His buddy asked why he needed a gun, and he told the story and that he intended to kill the guy. His friend refused to loan him a gun, so he decided to get one from another friend, and the first rode with him. He asked again for a gun, and the second guy asked the same question, and that guy also refused. Fortunately, I didn't own a gun at the time. At that point, he decided to simply beat the guy to death, and believe me, he was more than capable enough to do that. At any rate, the three of them drove back to the guy's house. He said that when he arrived, the guy's parents had some kind of party going on. He jumped out of the car and confronted the guy out in the yard and started beating on the guy. The guy was begging him not to kill him, insisting his wife had kept calling him to come over. They ended up down in the ditch, with the guy still begging while he beat on the guy. The guy's mother was out in the yard screaming. Then his two buddies jumped out of the car and grabbed him, tossing him in the back seat and driving away before the police could arrive. I wish I could have heard the guy explaining to his parents why someone was beating him out in the yard. Eventually, he got home and ran his wife off. Of course, there was all the begging and pleading. Then her father came over to talk to him. In all honesty, This was the first time I'd ever heard the statement where her father said, "We didn't raise her like this." So, that statement has been around at least since the late 60s. Eventually, with them all ganging up on him, he allowed her to return. That almost cost him his life. Now back to the good job and wife and baby. Everything seemed to be running smoothly for him. He told me he got home from work that night and no one was home. He said he figured his wife was out shopping with her mother or girlfriends. The evening went by and he started to get worried. He called her mother, who said she hadn't seen his wife. He called her girlfriends, who also said they hadn't seen her. He was now getting frantic. He called all the hospitals, thinking she might have gotten in a wreck. He called the police. No one knew anything. The night crawled by. The next day, he stayed home from work, still calling around, but he didn't get any answers. Late that evening, his phone rang, and it was one of his wife's friends. She was pretty upset and told him this story. Her cousin in the state of Alabama was seeing a married woman who refused to leave her husband. So, he went to her home and knocked on the door. When her husband answered, he shot and killed him right there. He left the state, and even though the police knew who he was, they couldn't find him. Meanwhile, here in Texas, his cousin lived, so he came here. He met my buddy's wife, and they started having an affair. One day, he decided not to let her leave and told her he was going to kill her husband that Friday at 5 o'clock when he got home from work. My buddy's wife didn't say a word, but her girlfriend, who knew her husband, couldn't live with her cousin killing him. So she called to warn him. She gave him the guy's name and told him the entire story. He told me he didn't know what to do. And to tell you the truth, if it had happened to me, I don't know what I would have done. At any rate, after thinking it over, he called the FBI and asked if they were looking for so-and-so wanted for murder in Alabama. They said, yes. Do you know his whereabouts? He said, no, but he's coming to my home Friday to kill me. He gave them all the information. He said that Friday they parked on the street behind his home and came in quietly through his back door. At 5 o'clock, as he was warned, a guy walked across his yard and up to his door, and the FBI jumped out and took the guy into custody. Needless to say, he filed for divorce. I was amazed they didn't arrest his wife as an accessory, but she claimed she was scared of the guy and he never left her alone. Right. At any rate, my buddy got full custody of his son, the house, the car, and everything else except for his wife's car and a stereo that she wanted. At that point, it was over, and he got that much-deserved nervous breakdown. That was almost unbelievable to me, but I trusted him and wasn't a big fan of his wife. A year or so later, he met a single mother, and they ended up getting married. His buddies were all teasing him, telling him he could do far better. I told him, she's a good woman, loves you, so don't listen to what they are saying. They've been together for 50 years now and had a few more kids. She stuck by him when he broke his back at work and has been the kind of wife every man needs. They still love each other to this day. The only thing I missed was back a year or two after he and his first wife got together. She had become great friends with my wife. My buddy told me his wife was a bad influence on my wife. I had no idea what he meant. I found out years later when she left me to enjoy her life when I had a sudden health issue. She never even asked our kids if they wanted to go with her. I recovered, and years later also found a much better woman. I understand this isn't the type of story you normally post, but it's true, and even though it's very old, some things never change. Commentary. Let me preface, not everyone deserves a second chance, but sometimes life has a funny way of teaching us lessons when we least expect them. Sometimes the people we trust the most end up hurting us, while strangers become our saving grace. This story reminds us that, in some cases, second chances often lead to the greatest happiness if we're brave enough to take them.